All right, let's dive into this. Human impact on the environment. We've got a lot to unpack here. You sent over a bunch of presentations about how we're affecting the air and the land. Big topics.
Yeah, definitely a lot to cover. But if we break it down, I think we can get a good handle on the challenges and, more importantly, what's being done to, address them.
Okay, that sounds like a plan. So the air we breathe, I mean, we kind of take it for granted, don't we?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget it's even there, but we'd be in big trouble without it. And you know what's funny? Most people think the atmosphere is mostly oxygen, right? Because that's what we need to breathe.
Right.
But it's actually nitrogen that makes up the vast majority of it, like around 78%.
78%. Wow, I had no idea it was that high. So what's all that nitrogen doing up there? Just taking up space.
Nope. It actually plays a really important role. It dilutes the oxygen, which, believe it or not, we need. Too much oxygen would actually be a bad thing.
Really? Wow, that's wild. Okay, so it's all about balance.
Exactly. And it's not just nitrogen and oxygen. There's also argon in the mix. And of course, carbon dioxide, CO2, which everyone's been talking about.
Yeah, and for good reason. But before we get into the heavier stuff like pollution and all that, the presentations do a good job of reminding us why we even care about the atmosphere in the first place.
Yeah, it's kind of important for, well, life as we know it.
Just a tad, I'd say. I mean, first of all, it acts as a giant shield, protects us from the sun's radiation.
Yeah, can you imagine getting a sunburn on a planetary scale? Not good. It also regulates temperature, drives weather patterns. The atmosphere is basically like the Earth's climate control system.
Speaking of climate, the presentations mentioned that CO2 acts like a blanket trapping heat. That's the greenhouse effect, right?
Exactly. And some greenhouse effect is good, actually. It's what keeps the planet warm enough for us to live on. The problem is too much CO2 from things like, burning fossil fuels is causing global warming. And that's where things start to go sideways.
It's like we're messing with the thermostat and things are getting a little too toasty.
I like that analogy. And we can't forget the other important roles the atmosphere plays, like distributing water around the planet, moderating climate, allowing for respiration breathing.
Oh yeah, try holding your breath for a few minutes and see what happens. It's actually pretty mind-blowing when you think about it, that even fish in the ocean rely on oxygen that originally came from the atmosphere.
It really shows you how interconnected everything on Earth really is.
And how much we depend on a healthy atmosphere. Speaking of which, the presentations do get into the not-so-fun stuff, air pollution.
Right, and we have to remember, air pollution isn't just an environmental issue. It directly affects our health, too.
Yeah, no kidding. I think we've all had those days where the air quality is just bad and you can feel it, like in your chest.
Absolutely. So when we talk about air pollution, we're talking about contamination of the air by all sorts of harmful stuff. Gases, tiny particles, even biological molecules. And a lot of it comes from, us. Burning fossil fuels, running factories, even just driving our cars.
Right, right. And they get pretty specific about the usual suspects, when it comes to air pollutants. Like carbon monoxide, which always freaks me out because you can't even see it or smell it.
Yep. It's called the silent killer for a reason. Especially dangerous in enclosed spaces. Basically what it does is it prevents your blood from carrying oxygen properly. Not good.
Definitely not something you want to mess with. And then there's sulfur dioxide, which I always think of as that awful smell you get sometimes, around industrial areas.
That's the one. And it's a major contributor to acid rain, which we'll get to in a bit.
Right, acid rain. And of course, we can't forget nitrogen oxides. Another big one for smog and acid rain. Double whammy.
For sure. And these are formed mainly from high-temperature combustion, like in car engines. And then there's particulate matter, which is literally like tiny particles that you breathe in.
Okay, see, that one freaks me out. Those are the ones that get deep into your lungs and cause all sorts of problems, right?
Exactly. And then the presentations also talk about volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which I always found interesting because they come from such ordinary stuff.
Yeah, like what?
Well, fuels, solvents, paints. I mean, we're surrounded by them.
Seriously, so like the stuff under our kitchen sinks could be contributing to air pollution?
Well, in a way, yeah. VOCs are a major ingredient in smog, and some of them are linked to long-term health problems too. Like some studies show that exposure to certain VOCs can increase the risk of cancer. So yeah, they might seem harmless because they're so common, but they're definitely something to be mindful of.
Okay, so we've got all these individual pollutants, but the presentations also talk about larger scale problems like smog and acid rain. So how do those fit into all of this?
So you've got all these different pollutants, right? It's like they're the ingredients. And then smog and acid rain. Those are the finished dishes.
Okay, I kind of like that analogy.
So smog, that's that hazy, kind of nasty stuff you see hanging over some cities.
Hmm.
It's a mix of pollutants, mostly the nitrogen oxides, VOCs, and ozone we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And the sunlight cooks it all up into, well, smog.
Yeah, it's like air pollution turned up to 11, and it
Yeah.
causes all those respiratory problems, eye irritation. It's nasty stuff.
Absolutely. And then there's acid rain. So those nitrogen and sulfur oxides we talked about, they can react in the atmosphere and they form acids. And those acids fall back to Earth. Rain, snow, even just dry particles.
So wait, even if it's not raining, that stuff is still coming down?
You got it. And it can have a big impact.
Yeah, I was going to say acid rain. Doesn't it just mean the rain's a little, more acidic? That's it.
It sounds kind of harmless when you put it like that. But it can really mess with ecosystems. Like, think about lakes, streams. Acid rain disrupts the balance, makes the water more acidic. And that can harm fish and other aquatic life.
It's like we're accidentally, I don't know, pouring acid into those ecosystems.
Good way to put it. And it's not just the water. Forests, crops, even buildings. Acid rain can damage all of them.
Wild. It's crazy how these things have such far-reaching effects. Which, speaking of, we can't forget about climate change. The presentations talk about how CO2 is like the big driver of global warming, but they also mention something called ocean acidification. What is that exactly?
Okay, so all that CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere, well, a lot of it actually gets absorbed by the oceans.
Oh, okay, so that's a good thing, right?
You'd think so, but here's the thing. When CO2 dissolves in water, it forms an acid.
Oh.
Yeah. Uh-oh, is right. So basically, the more CO2 we produce, the more we're acidifying the oceans.
So it's like we're trading one problem for another.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah.
And it's a huge problem for marine life, especially creatures with shells or skeletons made of, it's a mouthful, but calcium carbonate.
Like what? What kind of creatures?
Corals, shellfish. That acidification makes it harder for them to, build their shells, maintain them. It's pretty bad.
It's like we're slowly, I don't know, dissolving their homes.
Yeah. It really highlights how interconnected everything is. What we do on land, even if we don't see the effects right away, it can have a huge impact on the oceans.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, well, we've covered the air. What about the ground beneath our feet? The presentations were pretty clear. Human impact on the land, it goes way beyond just pollution, right?
For sure. It's easy to forget, but land is a resource too.
Yeah.
And just like any resource, we can overuse it, abuse it.
And even destroy it.
Exactly. The presentation spent a lot of time on deforestation, which is a major issue. I mean, we all know trees are important, right?
Yeah.
But the sheer scale of this problem is pretty mind-blowing. Forests cover something like 30% of the Earth's land surface, and we're losing them at an alarming rate.
30%, that's huge. I remember learning in school about how the Amazon rainforest is like the lungs of the Earth.
Exactly. Forests are vital for absorbing CO2, releasing oxygen. They help regulate the climate.
So when we clear forests, we're not just losing trees, we're losing a big part of the Earth's climate control system.
Exactly.
And it's not just climate change, is it? There's a whole domino effect, right? Like deforestation leads to other problems.
Oh, absolutely. Think about soil erosion. Trees, their roots, they help hold the soil in place. But without trees, the soil is vulnerable. It can be washed away by rain, blown away by wind.
Which leads to, like, water pollution, right?
Exactly. And then there's the loss of biodiversity. Forests are home to so many different species, plants, animals. And a lot of those species, you don't find them anywhere else on Earth. So when forests disappear, we lose those species too.
It's like a whole chain reaction of negative impacts.
Exactly.
And it all comes back to us, too. I mean, we need healthy forests, clean air, clean water. They even help with rainfall patterns, which is huge for agriculture.
That's right. Protecting forests isn't just about, saving trees. It's about protecting ourselves.
Well said. Okay, I have to ask about agriculture because, I don't know, it kind of feels like a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, it's how we feed the world, which is huge. But the presentations don't shy away from the negative impacts of agriculture either.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. We need agriculture. But the way we're doing it in a lot of places, it's just not sustainable. I mean, we're clearing huge areas of land for farmland. And a lot of times that means forests, other natural habitats are destroyed.
And then there are things like pesticides, fertilizer.
Right, and those are big concerns. Pesticides are designed to kill pests, which, can be important for protecting crops.
Yeah.
But they can also harm beneficial insects. They can contaminate water, even end up in our food. And fertilizers can cause problems too. polluting water, disrupting ecosystems.
It's like we're trying to solve one problem, how do we feed a growing population, but we create a bunch of new problems in the process.
I think that's a good way to put it. It really highlights the need for agriculture that's more sustainable,
Hmm.
you know, like organic farming, things like that.
So finding a better way to work with nature, not just try to control it.
Exactly.
So we've got deforestation, agriculture, what else? Oh, the presentations also mentioned desertification. What is that? That sounds kind of, I don't know, post-apocalyptic.
It's not quite as dramatic as the movies make it seem, but it's definitely a serious issue. Desertification is basically when fertile land turns into desert.
Oh, okay. So it's not just that existing deserts are getting bigger.
No, it's about land that was once fertile, good for growing things, becoming degraded, losing its productivity. And this can happen for a few different reasons. Deforestation, overgrazing, unsustainable agriculture. A lot of times climate change is a factor too. And it's a growing problem, especially in those drier parts of the world.
And I bet it has a huge impact on the people living in those areas.
Absolutely. Food insecurity,
Yeah.
water shortages, sometimes even people being displaced from their homes because of it. It's a big deal.
Wow. It really shows you we can't just take the land for granted. It's a resource. We have to treat it with respect. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around that, like whole landscapes changing. The presentations also talk about something called overexploitation. Is that connected to desertification at all?
Yeah, definitely. Overexploitation is basically like anytime we're taking more from the land, or the oceans for that matter, than it can replenish. So overgrazing is a good example where you have too many animals grazing in one area and they eat up all the vegetation, so the soil's left vulnerable, you get erosion. And then there's overfishing, which is a huge problem in the oceans.
Yeah, like we're emptying the oceans faster than they can refill. It's crazy. The presentations also mention unsustainable logging. Is that part of overexploitation too?
Absolutely. Unsustainable logging is when you're harvesting trees faster than they can regrow.
Yeah.
So you're disrupting the whole forest ecosystem, which can lead to, deforestation and all those problems. It's all about finding that balance, using resources, but making sure they're there for, future generations.
Right, right. Okay, so this is all pretty overwhelming, to be honest. Are there any bright spots in all of this? I mean, the presentations do talk about solutions, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's not all doom and gloom. There's actually a lot of really cool stuff happening, a lot of promising solutions.
Like what? What are some of the things people are doing?
Well, one that I thought was really interesting was, get this, responsible hunting.
Wait, really? Hunting? That doesn't sound like a solution.
I know, right? Sounds counterintuitive.
Oh,
But it actually can be a really important conservation tool.
how so?
Well, when it's done responsibly, sustainably, it can help keep wildlife populations in check, which is important because if you have too many animals in one area, it can lead to things like overgrazing, disease outbreaks, which can actually damage the whole ecosystem.
So it's about keeping things in balance, basically.
Exactly. Plus, a lot of times the money from hunting licenses, tags, all that, it goes right back into conservation efforts. So it's a win-win.
Yeah.
And, another benefit is that it helps protect crops, livestock from wildlife, which can be a real problem in some areas.
Oh, that's a good point. Hadn't even thought about that. Okay, so hunting. What else? What about this land reclamation thing? That sounds pretty intense.
It can be a pretty involved process, yeah. But it's amazing what they can do. Basically, you're taking land that's been damaged, disturbed, and trying to restore it. Get it back to something resembling its natural state.
I see. The presentations mentioned removing pollutants, like actually taking them out of the ground and replanting vegetation. That's a huge job.
It is, but it's amazing how resilient nature is. One really cool example is mine reclamation, where they've taken these areas that were basically just, destroyed by mining, and they've transformed them back into, like, functional ecosystems. And wetland restoration is another big one. Wetlands are so important, but we've lost so many of them.
Yeah, wetlands are like those areas that are kind of, underwater sometimes, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're super important for biodiversity, filtering pollutants. But yeah, we've been destroying them at an alarming rate. So restoring them is super important.
Right, right. Okay, so what about bioremediation? That one sounds like, I don't know, almost too good to be true, like something out of Star Trek or something.
I know, right? It sounds kind of sci-fi, but it's a real thing. Basically, you're using living organisms, mostly microorganisms like bacteria and fungi, to help clean up contaminated environments.
So instead of using like harsh chemicals or whatever, you're using like natural processes.
Yeah, exactly. These tiny organisms, they can break down pollutants, they can absorb them, or even transform them into something less harmful.
Wow. Who knew microbes could be so useful? This has been a really fascinating dive. I mean, we've covered so much, from the air we breathe to all the different ways we're impacting the planet. And yeah, it's kind of a lot to take in. But it's not all bad news, right? There's hope.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot we can do to make things better, but it takes all of us, being aware of these issues, making changes in our own lives, supporting sustainable practices. It's a collective effort.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. I hope you found it informative, maybe even a little inspiring. And remember, even small changes can make a difference. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and let's all do our part to protect this amazing planet we call home.